Friends, before introducing Paul Davey, I wanted to take a minute to let you know of a recent addition of a statue just outside Old Parliament House, a mere 100 metres from where we are sitting. Last December, Governor-General David Hurley unveiled a new statue of Australia's 18th Prime Minister, revealing a John Blackjack McEwen, smiling and holding grain in the palm of his hand. The new sculpture coincides with 100 years since the party formed, and along with a new mosaic, representing regional Australia in the parliamentary zone. National Centenary Chair Kay Hull said the statue showed the party luminary as he really was, rather than the blackjack persona. He was a visionary. He was a person that actually was a very happy person. He had a sense of openness. So the open hand with the grain also demonstrates generosity and care for other people, Mrs. Hull said. The cast bronze, full-body statue stands at the centre of a new mosaic symbolising the states and territories and industries important to regional Australia, with 7 branches. McEwen is depicted standing over bags of wheat, which Mrs. Hull said acknowledged his critical role in striking the nation's trade deals and his background as a farmer. The statue, rising up out of that, shows that there was strength and there was resilience, but most of all, there was passion and commitment to Australia, Mrs. Hull said. McEwen is known mainly for his 23 days as Prime Minister, while the Liberal Party chose a new leader after Harold Holt disappeared while swimming near Portsea in Victoria in 1967. He was Country Party leader and Deputy Prime Minister for nearly 13 years, from 1958 until his retirement. When unveiling the new statue, Governor-General Hurley recounted political journalist Laurie Oakes' observation that McEwen had been acting Prime Minister for 550 days over his career. The Governor-General said McEwen was a significant figure of Australia's recent history. As a former Prime Minister, it's appropriate that this statue of his joins the growing number of statues in the parliamentary triangle, he said. By all accounts, McEwen was equal parts fearsome, jovial, pragmatic and accessible, and had an immense intellect, the Governor-General said. The statue stands alongside a path well worn by McEwen, who as Trade Minister walked between the Provisional Parliament House and his department's offices in East Block. Turning now to Paul Davey. Paul Davey was born in England in 1947 and migrated to Australia in 1966. He became a journalist in 1966 and worked with the Press Gallery in Old Parliament House here in Canberra in the late 60s and early 70s. He also worked overseas and around Australia before becoming Senior Private Secretary to the Honourable Peter Nixon and then Federal Director of the National Party from 1983 to 1992. He was later a Senior Advisor to the Honourable John Anderson and General Secretary of the National Party New South Wales branch. Paul Davey is a political historian and published author. Paul, the screen is yours.
Professor Lovell, ladies and gentlemen, my apologies for not being online with you today, but unfortunately that's due to circumstances beyond my control. John McEwen made a pertinent point in a speech to the Country Party Federal Council in December 1968. Defending the government's tariff policies, so-called McEwenism, from criticism notably by wool and wheat growers, he said that over the previous 10 years, only 9 of the Tariff Board's 402 recommendations to the government had been rejected. And then he said, and I quote him, "Every time the government makes a decision on the Tariff Board's recommendation, it is made by members of a cabinet or ministry where the Country Party is outnumbered 3 to 1 by Liberal ministers." There's the key. In every coalition government, since the one first established between Earl Page and the United Australia Party's Stanley Bruce on the 9th of February 1923, the Country or National Party has had fewer ministers than has the UAP or subsequent Liberal Party, simply because it is numerically the smaller of the two parties. In other words, if Country or National Party policies or ideas were not good enough, they could be rejected. And the same numerical balance has applied in coalition shadow ministries. The underlying strength of coalitions has been based on an understanding by both parties that Australia's interests must come first, and the best way to ensure that is by cooperation, with compromise where necessary and even some muscle flexing, but not by confrontation. The Australian Country Party was formed on the 22nd of January 1920, essentially to argue for a better deal for farmers and people living and working in rural areas. When the Parliament met on the 25th of February, there were 11 Country Party members sitting on the cross benches. The Nationalists, forerunner of the UAP and Liberal parties, and at the time led by Billy Hughes, could maintain government, providing the Country Party did not side with Labor. The party's first leader was the member for Franklin in Tasmania, William McWilliams, who outlined the party's philosophy to Parliament on the 10th of March 1920, and I quote him, "I may say at the outset that the Country Party is an independent body, quite separate from the Nationalists or the Labor Party. We take no part in the deliberations of ministerialists or of the opposition. We intend to support measures of which we approve and hold ourselves absolutely free to criticise or reject any proposals with which we do not agree." Earl Page was more blunt, saying the socialist policies of the Labor Party were anathema to us, and we were in agreement that it would be better to keep the government on the rails than to assist a Labor government into office. Clearly, the Country Party was conservative. The election on the 16th of December 1922 saw the Country Party, then under Page's leadership, returned with 14 members and holding the balance of power. Page was interested in forming a coalition. He recognised that if his party was to really achieve results, get policies on the statute books, it had to be a part of government. But neither he nor the party room wanted to serve under Hughes, with the party room resolving that it would not support or cooperate with any ministry of which the present Prime Minister is a member. Ultimately, Hughes stood aside in favour of Stanley Bruce. He and Page developed the founding non-Labor coalition in February 1923, setting the format upon which all subsequent agreements have been based. The two parties maintained their independent identity. The Country Party leader was the second most senior member of the government and acted as Prime Minister during Bruce's absences. He was effectively the Deputy Prime Minister, although that title did not formally exist until being established by John Gorton in January 1968. The Bruce Page government held office until being defeated by Labor under Jim Scullin in October 1929. In subsequent years, non-coalition Conservative governments have only occurred on two occasions. January 1932 to November 1934, UAP led by Joe Lyons, and April 1939 to March 1940, UAP led by Robert Menzies. All non-Labor governments since then have been coalitions, even though on three occasions the Liberals had the numbers to govern in their own right, following the elections in 1975, 77 and 96. However, the respective Liberal leaders, Malcolm Fraser and John Howard, chose to support coalition government, reinforcing the relationship with the Nationals. Up to 1986, the Country National Party had been a partner in non-Labor governments for nearly 43 years, with 5 of its leaders having been Deputy Prime Ministers, 3 of whom, Earl Page, Arthur Fadden and John McEwen, also became Prime Minister. To the present time, the party's participation in joint governments has spanned 62 years, and 11 leaders have been Deputy Prime Ministers. The party can point to an impressive list of achievements, not just for agriculture, mining, manufacturing or export development, but also for people living and working beyond the capital cities, and in many instances for all Australians. The wisdom of being part of a coalition government has sometimes been questioned by the party membership, mainly on the grounds that the party's contributions and even its existence get smothered by use of the term coalition policy, or by major announcements often being made by the Prime Minister on policies for which a country National Party minister has been responsible. Maintaining a public profile as an independent party and as the smaller partner in coalition has always been challenging. One answer was for the party to widen its policy base and change its name to broaden electoral appeal. Another was for the leader to deliver a separate policy speech at elections, but this was changed to a joint coalition launch from 2004, to the disappointment of many party members. Tensions within the party organisations regarding coalition opposition have often been deeper, as we shall see. Up to June 1974, the non-Labor parties tended to favour cooperating but not forming coalition oppositions. The first coalition opposition was established after John Curtin formed a Labor government from October 1941, when Arthur Fadden's budget failed to pass the House. Fadden, who had been uniquely elected as Prime Minister by the joint parties in August 1941, after Menzies resigned, was confirmed again by the joint parties as the opposition leader. On the return of the Curtin government at the 1943 election, the UAP and country parties agreed to cooperate but not continue in formal coalition. With the Whitlam government's election in December 1972, Doug Anthony and Liberal leader Billy Snedden agreed to cooperate outside coalition, but they formalised coalition after Gough Whitlam successfully exploited policy differences between the two parties in the June 1974 election campaign. From that point to the present day, the National and Liberal parties have maintained coalition when in opposition. As mentioned, it hasn't always been plain sailing, as was dramatically evidenced by the Joe for Canberra campaign, which had its genesis after the Queensland election on the 2nd of November 1986, at which the Nationals were returned in their own right, contrary to virtually all opinion polls. The Joe campaign exploded over the first half of 1987, a core objective being to break the coalition opposition in Canberra. To that degree it worked, because the coalition was ended for 100 days, although the party leaders John Howard and Ian Sinclair quickly restored it after the July 87 federal election, and Dr. Prasser may well have more to say on this. In the 66 years from the formation of the Country Party to the end of 1986, coalition oppositions existed for only 7 years. But in the 34 years from 1986 to the end of 2020, they have existed for 15 years. They've become the norm, despite party conferences from time to time calling for them to end. The principal theory being that outside coalition, the party would be better able to highlight its independent policies and identity. That, of course, sounds good, but it does ignore the sort of problems that Anthony and Snedden faced in 1972 to 74. And further, as a report for Federal Council concluded in 1988, and I quote, "There is no electoral statistic in existence today to support an argument that the National Party would be better able to win power in federal parliament by standing outside coalition," meaning, of course, opposition coalition. Historically, the Federal Parliamentary Party has enjoyed considerable autonomy. It can work under its own rules and is not bound by organisational policies, providing its actions do not conflict with the party's federal constitution. Today's constitution still gives the parliamentarians those rights, but does require the federal leader to advise the Federal Management Committee if the parliamentary party is going to act inconsistently with organisational policy, and to consult with and consider the views of the Management Committee before entering into, altering the terms of, or terminating a coalition in government or opposition. How many times, it can be asked, has the coalition, in government or opposition up to 1986, come under serious threat? In my view, the answer is 3. The first was when Earl Page stood down as Prime Minister, after the UAP elected Robert Menzies to succeed Joe Lyons, who had died in office in April 1939. Against advice from close party colleagues, Page questioned Menzies' suitability to lead the nation with the world teetering on the brink of war. This did Page no good at all. It broke the coalition for 11 months, it split the Parliamentary Country Party, and it led to Page's resignation as party leader in September 1939. It's worth noting that while there was no love lost between Page and Menzies, the latter recognised Page's political worth and accepted him in senior ministerial roles in future governments from October 1940 to January 1956. And that's an example of putting the national interest ahead of personal or political preference. The second and possibly best known confrontation came at the end of December 1967 when McEwen was Prime Minister and openly said that his party would not continue in coalition if the Liberals elected their deputy leader, Bill McMahon, to succeed Harold Holt. McEwen's rationale was simple. He didn't trust McMahon. In the end, McMahon decided to remain deputy and John Gorton became Liberal leader and Prime Minister. While McEwen, with the backing of his party room, had indeed threatened the coalition, his action actually saved it and enabled it to remain in office for almost 5 more years. The third event, as already mentioned, was the Joe for Canberra campaign. Certainly there were disagreements from time to time on many issues, which no doubt strained relations, but they were resolved before reaching breaking point. McEwen noted only 2 serious disagreements with Menzies during his almost 13 years as Country Party leader. One was over the timing of an election and the other over a proposed redistribution which would have reduced the number of rural electorates. On both counts, Menzies accepted McEwen's arguments, illustrating both cooperation and compromise. Tensions were often high over the value of the Australian dollar. And on one occasion, late in 1971, during a marathon cabinet meeting, the Country Party ministers Doug Anthony, Ian Sinclair and Peter Nixon walked out 3 times before the issue was resolved. And yes, of course, there has been some muscle flexing. Earl Page showed Prime Minister Joe Lyons how tenuous his hold on government was when in October 1934 he objected to a Lyons motion that the House should adjourn for the forthcoming Melbourne Cup. Labor and Lang Labor indicated support for Page's position, meaning the motion would be defeated. Lyons withdrew the motion and formed a coalition with the Country Party, effective from the 9th of November. That was flexing muscles, but rather than threatening a coalition that didn't exist, it formed one that governed for almost 4.5 years to April 1939. In the December 1949 election campaign, during which Menzies and Fadden pledged to form a joint government if successful, Menzies equivocated over when petrol rationing might end. Fadden was convinced it could be done immediately and persuaded Menzies accordingly, enabling Fadden to declare in his policy launch, and I quote, "Our slogan brings hope to a browbeaten people, empty out the Chifley socialists and fill the Bowsers." The election heralded the start of 23 years of coalition rule, and the announcement to end petrol rationing was made on the 8th of February 1950. That was a bit of muscle flexing, but also a hugely popular policy for an electorate that had tolerated rationing for years. And Doug Anthony had a cheeky win after the coalition went into opposition following the 1983 election. He encouraged his senators to support a Hawke government proposal to increase the size of Parliament, something the Liberals opposed. Anthony believed it was justified because there had been no significant increase in the number of members or senators since 1949, even though the number of voters had almost doubled. The size of the Parliament was increased, a bit of muscle flexing that annoyed Liberal leader Andrew Peacock, but caused no damage to the coalition. We should not forget occasions when country National Party leaders went out on a limb to promote coalition policy, knowing that their party's own members, or even the wider constituency, could be opposed. John McEwen's negotiation of the Japan-Australia Agreement on Commerce, signed in 1957, when Japanese atrocities against Australian prisoners of war during World War II was still raw in many people's mind, is a case in point. He took on the project as his policy, not the government's policy. And I quote him, "I was making sure that if I were to fall on this, the government would not have to fall with me." Doug Anthony seriously stirred the pot among party members in 1978 with the introduction of import parity pricing for oil, which increased fuel prices, especially for farmers. And Tim Fisher's support for tougher gun laws after the Port Arthur shooting massacre of April 1996, an issue to be discussed by Professor Frame, is perhaps the best example. He copped heaps from party meetings and conferences across Australia, and notably in Queensland. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, it is surely a credit to the parties concerned to be able to say that for the majority of the time, from 1923 to 1986 and through to today, coalitions have worked well, not the least of them being that led by John Howard from 1996 to 2007. Thank you, and I wish the rest of your day every success.
Thank you very much, Paul. Paul has today reminded us of the important history of the National Party, sharing the story of an organisation that has made an enormous contribution to Australia's social and economic development. Bringing an earthiness to today's presentation and subsequent chapter from Paul assesses the major strains that have occurred in the coalition partnership, as well as examples of compromise, cooperation, and elements of muscle flexing. The author of 90 Not Out, Politics in the Blood, and Joe for PM, we thank Paul for his time today and wish him well. I now turn the screen over to Professor David Lovell.